Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Barnyard Broadcast. My name is Maddie Horkler, your host, and today on this episode, we are going to talk a little bit more about biosecurity. We have three people on the podcast today: Genevieve Christ, Hannah Walters, and Craig Williams. Together, they have a wide variety of experiences with biosecurity and knowledge about this topic. Without further ado, let's get into the conversation. All right, hello everybody. We're going to get started with today's episode. Hannah, would you mind going ahead and giving us a small introduction?
Sure. My name's Hannah Walters. I am the Director of Producer Education and Engagement for the Pennsylvania Beef Council, as well as the State Beef Quality Assurance Coordinator, or BQA, for those of you that are part of that program. I've organized several hands-on biosecurity workshops for producers throughout the state and the Northeast. And I also currently serve as the National Secure Beef Supply Advisory Committee member. I'm super passionate about helping producers really achieve their goals that they have set up for their operation, and bettering their operation in any way that we can help with. And my husband and I, along with our two boys, live on my family's farm in Western Pennsylvania. We maintain a small cow-calf herd, and we've also still do small square bales because we really love the weather to dictate our time. But in all reality, there's a lot of equine folks out this way. And so that's another good way to diversify our income there on the farm. So looking forward to discussing more about biosecurity.
Perfect. Craig, would you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, Maddie. Hi, it's Craig Williams from Penn State Extension in Tioga County. I've been a county agent for probably 35 plus years up here. Lately, I've been doing a lot of composting work as one of my programs, and that involves then a lot of the HPAI response, including a national response out to California. Got some hands-on experience with the dairies and the poultry farms, in the California experience. So biosecurity can kind of come to me from multiple levels. The county fair, where, we really wonder what are we doing, up to regular farms and then mass disasters. So, there's all different levels to that subject. So yeah, it'd be great to have a discussion today.
Sweet. Jenny, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Genevieve Christ. I work for Penn State Extension, specifically with the Center for Ag Conservation Assistance Training. And one of the things that I do there with the center is I work with conservation professionals and other individuals that are visiting farms. And so biosecurity is something that I talk about often to that audience because sometimes they are not coming from an ag background. And so just explaining, why we follow biosecurity, the importance of it, and the steps, and really making it simple for them to understand is something that I love to talk about. And I came from a previous role where I talked about pesticide safety, which to me is kind of similar to biosecurity. It's something that we don't like to talk about because it's boring and sad, and sometimes people don't care, but it's really important. So I like to talk about it a lot, especially when we think about the whole farm, not just the livestock on the operation.
Absolutely. And as always, I'm your host, Maddie Horkler, and I'm going to be moderating today's conversation. So we'll get started, and I'm going to start broad or more open in terms of the question and ask, for the producers who are listening, what is one of the biggest mistakes that you see when people go ahead, either write biosecurity plans or think about biosecurity for their overall operation?
Sure, I can start with that one. I see a lot of beef producers, obviously, with my job, and I do work with some dairies as well. I think really one of the biggest mistakes or misconceptions of biosecurity is just really overcomplicating it or ignoring it altogether. I feel like a lot of folks think that biosecurity has to be this massive, expensive overhaul on their operation, but it really doesn't. It doesn't need to cost you thousands of dollars or require a degree to figure it out. It just really needs your attention. And so too often, I think biosecurity gets pushed to the back burner like some other important things until it's a threat. But then by then, I feel like it's sometimes, often too late, or it's very hard to play catch up. And I'm sure the other folks on the call can probably chime in too. When we see a disaster, even with high path and the poultry, all government entities are short staffed, right? And so when we have a disease like that blow through and you're required to have these plans approved and all of these other steps that are taking place, it's really hard to start from scratch. So I really think the biggest mistake is just really overcomplicating it or ignoring it altogether, especially when there's so many resources out there to really help you get started. And essentially, it's just really a plan to keep you ahead and keep your cattle moving and your business running.
I think Hannah, I think that was right. We tend to make it overcomplicated, and whether it's a beef or dairy farm, I almost look at it as, first it's the gateway onto the farm, and who's coming onto the farm, which relates then to where they're going. So if you knock out those two right away, you pretty much have a good idea what areas of the farm no one's coming to and what areas are obviously high traffic. And then right after that, I put in the baby calves, heifers, cows, put them in order of what our greatest risk is. And that'll pretty much open up the farm for where we maybe have a problem for the greatest risk. If the baby calves are obviously the biggest risk, and they may not be, because it might be the pregnant cows that are the biggest risk, but at least it starts you down that path. Who's coming on the farm? What gates can I shut if I need to, and where are people going? And I think that probably gets us 70% of the biosecurity plan done, along with, maybe a list of who those people are.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. And I think probably coming from my perspective with my background in agronomic crops and a little bit of animal science, we forget about the people that aren't coming to the farm to deal with the animals. So thinking about the custom applicators, the feed delivery, well, that's still animals, but even, the seed delivery guy, anybody that might be coming out to walk our fields, write our conservation plan, do soil testing, they can also bring things onto that farm, even if they haven't been working with animals. We talk about invasive plants and noxious weed seeds and things that can be moved. So I think that for me is probably one of the biggest biosecurity mistakes, is that we're very much focused on the livestock, which is really, really important. But we also need to consider the other parts of the operation and the effects that, something could have on those.
I know. I believe it was one of Hannah's biosecurity workshops. We talked about delivery people, FedEx and Amazon, and those guys coming in. And that's a big problem because you don't know how many farms they have gone to. And sometimes those drivers aren't educated in terms of biosecurity. So I was just going to backpack that one right off of that question.
No,
but
that's a really good point. And I guarantee you they are not educated on biosecurity and have no understanding. So yeah, that's a really good point to bring up, is who's coming on the farm.
Yeah. And to keep kind of the conversation flowing, we'll talk a little bit about coming animals off of farms. So I know, Craig, you talked a little bit about, the show and that sort of stuff. You guys have like maybe a step-by-step guide or just some tips to people that are taking animals off the farm and bringing them back, no matter what the circumstance. What's some things that they can do in terms of biosecurity to protect themselves?
I can kick this one off as well. I used to show, so I kind of I've dabbled into all of those sort of things. Early on in our show career, biosecurity admittedly was not a concern, right? We weren't as educated on what that meant, and which was a little bit alarming looking back on it now, because we had a commercial herd too, right? And so we're a cow-calf operation trying to raise up these calves and sell them to folks, whether they're retaining those heifers to breed back on their own operations, or whether they're utilizing them as feeders. Regardless, we don't want to spread disease, and we don't want to bring anything that's going to impact our cattle and our business back. And so as we started thinking about that later on in our show career, it was it was give or take. Did we want to spend money on extra equipment, or did we want to spend the time to clean that and effectively clean that? And our worry was there could be some things that we miss or skip. And so ultimately what we decided to do is, before we even went to the show, check our own stock, get those health papers, make sure everything was good to go, make sure all of our equipment was clean. But we did have a separate trailer and a separate group of equipment, whether that be show sticks, holders, feed tubs, water buckets, all of those things that we needed for our show. Those never came back onto our property. They were always in a separate little trailer that we kept off property. We washed them at the show, but then they would never come back onto the property if we didn't absolutely need to. And then we really just, again, made sure our supplies and all of those things were separate. Then once we got to the show, just making sure that everything around us was clean. And we typically jackpotted pretty heavy, so we would show off a trailer if we could, just in order to kind of keep away from others, because we don't know, what they have or what could be lurking within. So we always tried to show off the trailer if we could. And then when we came home, we did have a small isolation pen that was further away from our commercial cows. It wasn't in direct contact with feed or water. They didn't have nose-to-nose contact. We ideally would try to keep them away for 21 days, but most times it was like 7 to 14 because of the small space we were working with, right? We didn't have a show barn that was separate from our commercial barn. So we were kind of limited there on what we could do, but we tried our best and to disinfect everything, especially the cattle. We always washed them before they even got on the trailer to go to the show. We washed the trailer out away from the barn. And then disposed of anything, at the show versus bringing it home to dispose. And that's really, I think, when you look at, you can have all sorts of levels of biosecurity when it comes to shows, but I feel like the animal aspect and the equipment aspect is pretty important. The other thing we would always do is we'd have show clothes and show boots. Those always went to shows. And then when we got home, we had boots in the barn that were for the barn. And it could be difficult sometimes, right? Especially when you're rolling in at 1 a.m. You just want to go to bed. You don't want to change your shoes or maybe even your jeans or whatever else you got going on. And you don't want to wash the trailer off site. And so that can complicate things for sure. But I really think consistency really is the key, and just understanding what you could be bringing back to the farm. And that really kind of opened up our eyes a lot. We were not perfect at it, right? And especially if you have multi-generations on farm, we still have some hard times with grandpa just trifling around and whatever he's getting into and coming back to the farm like, oh my gosh, you were just over at the neighbors fixing the tractor. What are you doing? Change your shoes, pap. So yeah, we all live and breathe, I think, different variations of biosecurity. So just have a plan at least to start with. I think you'll go a long way with that.
Hannah, you brought up a really good point, and I just wanted to touch on it before we, change directions about being perfect. Hannah, you brought up a really great point about being perfect. And I think that's something that prevents a lot of people from doing biosecurity, is that they're like, if I can't do it all, then I'm not going to do it at all. And that's really not how we want to think about that. Like, any effort you make, any time you can do a little bit better is worth it with biosecurity versus that all or nothing aspect. Like, if I can't do it all, why would I do it? No, any effort you can make is a step in the right direction. And so I love that, in your personal life and at home, yeah, grandpa sometimes doesn't follow the rules, but that's okay. We still remind him of that. And we, are familiar with what risks, are out there. And that's really important.
Yeah, that washing the boots, if you didn't have separate boots, but you physically washed them, that's the same thing. It makes you think about it. That isolation, I mean, we've always preached that isolation pen, and it's so hard to do, especially in the dairy world, where you got, 3 animals out of 200 dairy herd cattle herd, and you're just throwing them back into the freestall barn. It's so hard to do, but you got to think about it. On the positive side of that, for the most part, for a show, you're taking your most healthy animals. And so for the most part, if your animal is under the weather, you should really have not taken it to the show to start with. And so from that standpoint, if everybody had that same philosophy, we got to hope that all the animals at the show are still the most, healthy ones. They're the ones being taken care of. Now we know that that's not going to always happen, and somebody's going to get sick. But if you are at least thinking about it and you realize that somebody's sick at the show, boy, we ought to really have a heightened awareness then, for everything to come back home, just really think about it. So, that isolation is probably the golden child, but it's so hard to do, but we know that it works. So
I worked with a dairy farm in the past, Craig, that would only take cows getting ready to be dried off to a show. And now our show was like the beginning of September, but that's what they would bring. And it wasn't a very competitive show either. So they were lucky they had that option because that made it easier for them to isolate because they would just take them home and dry them off and they'd be in their own little separate dry cow pen. But when you have to continue to milk those animals, I know it's really hard with a dairy to have that isolation.
And I guess speaking on the topic of isolation, there's a lot of, and I know Hannah and the beef cow guys do it, and the dairy might as well, but they do closed herds. And when you think of closed herds, you're not bringing anything in, really, bulls or anything like that. But they probably still have some biosecurity risks. So would you like to elaborate on maybe some of those biosecurity risks that those closed herds aren't thinking of? And we kind of touched a little bit on it, delivery men and that sort of thing. But is there anything glaring in your mind that you can think of for those types of farms?
yeah, I don't think, that's a great point. I don't see closed herd and disease biosecurity quite the same, because I was always thinking of, a closed herd and you're breeding, and a closed herd and that's your only animals that you have. Where an open herd, you may be buying and selling a lot of animals, and so you have a lot more of that turnover. Um, so I think we probably have to be careful how we use the term closed herd first, because if it was closed herd and it's only your breeding, and we're talking about breeding diseases, that would be one direction. But if we're talking about basic biosecurity diseases that, you're bringing a little bit of manure home from the show or something, I don't think having a closed herd makes any difference, in that case. So it might be one of those terms that we in the ag industry probably got to be careful what we're using the word closed herd for, in this case. I think about our time in California and where some of those herds may have gotten infected or not with HPAI. That had nothing to do with closed herd. That had to do everything with traffic, traffic on and off the farm. I don't have the closed herd word, really related to biosecurity. I mean, that's fine, but I think, it's a great point. I mean, Hannah, what do you think?
Yep. Yeah, and we actually, when we talk about biosecurity with BQA, we often hear that question. Well, I'm a closed herd and I don't vaccinate, so I don't think, is this like really something I need to worry about? I'm like, So we try to always encourage, discussing the 3 Ps: people's, pests, and practices. So those are really where your biggest threats are going to come from, aside from incoming animals. So what we like to point out to producers is some of those biggest threats, you're likely not even considering them to be a threat, like neighbors stopping by, whether they come to stop and help you, or they're just making a visit, or maybe it's even your vet making a routine visit. Where do they often walk to find you? If you're not out in the driveway, right? They walk into your barn. And no one really thinks twice about those types of folks. So that could really be a risk that you're not considering, and that has nothing to do with whether you're a closed herd or not, right? So maybe your disease risk or the threat that you're looking at in terms of biosecurity maybe animal disease or breeding diseases, that's very low on your list, right? But there are other biosecurity threats to you that don't have anything to do with your reproductive or being closed or open herds wise. Folks can carry pathogens on their boots, their hands, their equipment. So vehicles, and I think we had mentioned earlier too about borrowed equipment or custom application, wildlife, things of that nature all still can impact you regardless if you're a closed herd or not. But I think sometimes that is a misconception producers have is, oh, well, I'm closed, so I don't have to worry about a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, and Hannah, just to add on to that, you covered pretty much everything that I was thinking about of other ways, except streams on farms and whatever is upstream. And so, I work a lot in conservation with conservation professionals, and we're always encouraging stream bank fencing, not just for the environmental benefits of it, but also thinking about the animal health and safety. If you can provide water in a different way other than that stream, because anymore, we have no idea what is coming from upstream. And we know that a lot of these diseases can be passed through that water system. So that's another area where I think people overlook, is, what is upstream from you, and are the cows having, I say cows, livestock having access to that stream. It's not just cows.
And you don't know typically too a lot of wildlife. You don't know what's in that stream right next to whatever livestock you may have, and it impacts all species, not just cattle. You're right. So definitely something to consider. I have a friend Lisa from the Dakotas, and they had an anthrax outbreak, and unfortunately that traveled down through water. And I would preach there to communication. If you do have an outbreak of something, I feel like, especially in the cattle industry, we're very hush hush. We don't, in the beef industry, we don't want to say, oh gosh, I have this, or oh gosh, this is popping up here. We're kind of sometimes tend to be secretive about that because whether we're embarrassed or we don't want to be the pinpoint of something that has come in. But they could have prevented a lot of loss of cattle had somebody said something or said, hey, we've just lost, X number of cattle in the last month, and it's an unusually high number. Just be on the lookout. So communication can go a long way as well, I really think, and I would encourage folks to communicate. I know in the dairy industry, there was talks of things, unforeseen things occurring down in that Texas region in November and December before we even calculated what exactly it was, right? So communication, I think, helped because they were on alert a little bit of, hey, there's something going on. We need to really focus in on some of these symptoms and make sure that we're checking our herd for whatever it is that's going on, even before we were able to label it. So I think communication either way can really be a valuable asset.
Absolutely. And there's one other thing I want to touch on, and we might have covered a lot of the things that you can do, and I know, Hannah, you talked a little bit about diversifying farm income, and a lot of people nowadays have been using agritourism as that way to diversify either a market or selling meat off farm, those types of things. And we were talking a little bit about unusual traffic that's not animals. And I think that is something that is going to become more of a problem in terms of biosecurity. And I just didn't know if you guys had any thoughts about that or ways you can mitigate those types of risks associated with your farm health.
Yeah, and agritourism is kind of almost like the FedEx guy. We don't want to view them as total, biosecurity risk because I mean they do wash your trucks too and they're clean, and here we're doing agritourism and somebody's going to come and have an ice cream or see something at the farm. Well, most likely that tourism person has not been on another farm, right? So let's assume that they're fairly clean. Now, did we just invite 10, 15 families onto the farm that weren't there last year? Yeah, that's true. And we definitely have more traffic on the farm. So, we do need to think about that. And then is our agritourism set up that it's only there the ice cream stand and maybe, a couple calf pens, but it's not the whole farm. So I kind of put it back to, okay, what gate are they coming from, and where are they going on the farm, and there's a regulated spot. Now, what do you do with the first grader elementary school tour then? And we're walking them around the farm. Well, they're probably most likely fairly clean too, but you don't know, and you are showing them the whole farm. Or is at the time where our big farms are now doing actual tours, and it's a school bus. You actually never get off the bus. So I'm not really sure what we do yet with agritourism, as much as think about where you're taking them, and where you're not taking them, and I kind of loop them into, what's the risk level. Now, a farm tour, and you're not sure who those farmers are and where they came from, well, maybe that's the time to purchase plastic boots, right? Because we know that there's going to be people on the farm tour, the farmers tour, that probably have boots from home or something like that, or maybe it's even dust on their clothes. But I think we have always a tough time with agritourism. How bad do we want to make biosecurity this big scare factor, and how bad do we want to just have it some realistic practices that we can handle?
So, Craig, you brought up a really good point. This is not an ag example, but I think it's something that should be replicated. So last summer, I went to Mammoth Cave National Park and did a cave tour. And then the bus pulled up to a spot, and they're like, okay, you're going to walk across this thing and your feet are going to get disinfected for any bat diseases. And I was like, oh my goodness, we're practicing biosecurity. Like, I knew what that was. So I think, in an agritourism setting, like if you are bringing a bunch of kids on the school and you're going to have them walking, maybe through the barns, those mats, I can't think of if that's the right word or not for them, but basically
mats.
The foam mat, just have them walk across it. The kids will think it's so much fun. I can imagine them like jumping on the mat and just having a good time disinfecting themselves. And then, as a side note, when I talk with conservation professionals and I talk about visiting farms, I talk about areas where they don't really need to be going, areas of high risk. They don't need to be walking through feed bunkers. They don't need to be walking through areas where there's manure piled up. So that's the other thing, is keeping the public, out of those areas of risk too.
Yeah, and I think you guys really hit the nail on the head there when you discussed the flow of the tour. So that's something in their workshops. We've had several producers that agritourism is fairly common on their operation, and so we've really encouraged them just to take a few minutes and talk about the flow, right? We don't want to go see our mature cattle first and then end with the calves, right? Because in that time, especially if they're doing something hands-on or they have manure on their shoes at some point from being with those cows, and then we're going and finishing with the calves, then you've just created potential disease spread on your own farm, right? So biocontainment is also important to think about with agritourism. So really understand the flow of your tour. And calves and kids, boy, they will lick each other and touch each other and spread disease like crazy.
Yeah.
So I always encourage.
Great thing, but it's a bad thing.
Right. I always encourage, if you're going to give exposure to calves, which they're cute, fluffy, everybody loves them, maybe have a few that are just strictly designated to your agritourism. They kind of stay away from everybody else. And when they've matured up to be too old to be a part of that, keep them isolated just for a little while, and make sure that we're providing hand sanitizer or a washing station right next to them, and encourage everyone to use it. And I always encourage all of my producers, just provide some sort of boot wash or boot covers for anybody coming in onto the farm, because you don't know, especially if they've traveled abroad, they might not think that petting zoo that they went to where the water buffalo are could be a potential FMD risk, right? So they just wore those same shoes there a week ago, and we have no idea. And so we don't want to ever put ourselves at risk. And I think oftentimes just a quick explanation of, hey, there's lots of diseases all over the world. And in the United States, we're really proud of being disease free with some of those. So in efforts to continue that and keep our production facilities and our animals and our food safe, we just want you to toss these boots on. It's nothing more than if you were going into a hospital, right? The other caution I would give is if you do have the boot mats, those only work as well as they're maintained. So if we have a group of kindergartners going through that, if we're not changing it, and then we have the feed sales rep and somebody else that's mucked through the pasture and they're all walking over that, then it just becomes a cesspool for disease. So those can be really effective tools as long as you're really effective at managing them. So if you know that you're not great about remembering to change things or manage things like that, maybe go with the boot cover option or even soap and water. I believe it's something like 90% of a lot of our diseases that we're focused on are eliminated with hot soapy water. So that might be a good first point of action as well.
And I guess that FMD conversation will kind of segue into my next question, because what do you guys think as a whole, or if you have any comments about what can livestock producers do to prepare themselves for an outbreak? Because, poultry in particular, they're high on biosecurity as well as many swine facilities. But sometimes our livestock, our beef cattle, our sheep, and our goats, we can get a little lax. So, and it's just because we don't think about it as much. And you guys have any advice or comments about things that we can do to prepare ourselves or keep ourselves safe?
I think there's a couple things we can do, and I'd probably put it in this order. Poultry's been highly regulated, and swine are semi highly regulated, and then we kind of go dairy, beef, sheep and goats down, in that order. And I'm coming at it from a standpoint, like, say you're part of a marketing cooperative of all natural beef or Land O'Lakes or some other dairy cooperative. Well, they have vested interest in you having a biosecurity plan that starts thinking through these steps. Because if you're part of a natural beef group and you get an outbreak, they want to keep all their other natural beef producers ready to go and keep marketing. And so it's really, they're trying to look out, the co-op or the buying group, selling group, are looking out for you as a cooperator. And the biosecurity plan is to help get that done. So I think, we should participate in these programs that are out there. Hannah kind of spoke about that early on. Once the disease is here, there's going to be all kinds of other people involved, so it's not about that. It's more just getting yourself ready and just going through the exercise of the biosecurity plan helps with a lot of things we've just talked about. Where do I have a gate I can shut off, and all of a sudden the farm is completely, locked down and nobody can come on, if we don't want them. The other side of that is just knowing what the basic symptoms are of these diseases. And when something's wrong or something doesn't seem right, that's the time to reach out, like we talked about, whether it's through communication or checking with your vet. A little bit of the HPAI and dairy cattle was that way. Something was wrong, but nobody was really sure what it was for a while until we finally had enough people look at it, and then it kind of ended up with its own life after that. If we hadn't had a heightened awareness about biosecurity, we don't know how much longer that would have gone on. But, that could easily happen with, what are the symptoms of FMD, and do you look for that? Just be aware of that.
I'm going to add an additional note to everything Craig said is we also have to think about the animals that are not livestock that can be carriers of livestock diseases. So deer, elk, gazelles, whatever that's out there, those animals can also carry these diseases. And so, are we able to limit the interactions that those animals have with our livestock? And sometimes that's really hard to do, but just to be aware that that can also be a driver of a lot of different diseases, not just FMD.
And that would go right along with who's on the farm, right? If your farm's totally isolated and not much wildlife, you know that. But if you're in an area that has a lot of wildlife coming through, it's part of that, Jenny. Who's on the farm? What's your population around you? Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I would tag along on that same thought process that Craig kind of went through. I think in reality, your first step is really just basic biosecurity. Get a plan written down. Oftentimes, when we sit down and we're doing these workshops and we're filling out biosecurity plans, some of these things like having clean boots and clean clothes, you're already doing some of these steps, right? You don't think maybe that's biosecurity, but it is. So have a plan written down. A lot of these basic biosecurity plans you can find online. They're really a foundation for that secure beef supply or secure milk, whatever secure supply you're looking at with whatever species you may have. Get that thing planned and filled out if you can ahead of time, because that is going to be your ticket to business as close to as common and usual as it can be, right? So that's really what they're going to want in terms of permitting to move cattle. If FMD hits here, essentially we will be shut down for a bare minimum of 72 hours. So all cattle on road need to find a place to go and get there. That may become a whole nother situation because folks may not want to accept those cattle on road, right? But just try to think through some of those things. If you're cow-calf operation, you've just weaned your calves and you've just shipped them off, are you going to accept them back? What does that look like? Think through some of those things, because as we know, if it does and when it does hit here, it's not going to be business as usual. You're going to have supply delays, restricted movements, evolving protocols. And I think the other tip I would give is a great biosecurity plan is flexible, right? You go into it knowing that you may have to change protocols. You may have guidance that comes in that we weren't expecting because of one thing or another. So just really have a basic foundation. Make sure everybody on the farm understands if X, Y, or Z were to happen, this is what we're going to start doing. If we can start implementing the basics, like understanding who's coming on and off our farm and documenting that, keeping clean clothing and clean boots, making sure we have some sort of clean and dirty line, you're going to be a lot further ahead than most of your peers in the industry. So I think anything you can do is really an insurance policy for you and your operation and to keep moving. If something like FMD hits, it's going to be a rough, bumpy road, right? We've not experienced it in a long time, and so it's going to be difficult. And with as drastic movement of cattle, especially that we have in this country, it's going to spread like wildfire, right? So it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to contain it and get it stopped. And it's going to take cooperation of everybody. And if we can be planned ahead of time and be prepared, then we can hopefully reduce the risk of it impacting our operations as deeply as it could.
To continue sort of this conversation, I feel like in the world today, I'd be short-sighted if I didn't talk a little bit or offer you guys the floor to talk a little bit about your thoughts on HPI, and then as well as New World screwworm and how that is going to be affecting, producers local to Pennsylvania, but also, producers across the United States. Any thoughts or comments or anything about those two situations that are going on right now?
Hannah brought up a good point about the producers who are being affected by all the other logistics that happen because someone became an outbreak. And that may be part of the biggest part of the biosecurity plan we haven't talked about. That if you can't ship milk for, 4 days, or, you can't ship cattle for 4 days or 2 weeks, you need to be internally prepared for that, because you're not infected, but your entire farm is affected because the whole supply chain is stopped. And that is, we talk about, well, HPAI is, we're now milk testing, all the herds. Well, that didn't really change anybody. But as soon as that first herd is affected, that circle around them, they're not going to ship milk until everybody's, completely free, or completely sure. So I think there's some of those other consequences that probably are as more important than if you became the actual herd, that was infected. Like Hannah said, we have a lot of animals on the road. They're going to need to either go somewhere or be put somewhere until the slaughter plant is ready to, accept them or whatever. So there's a lot of these other things that I think, could possibly happen. HPAI, I know that a couple of the farmers that I've talked to, they still don't know how they got infected. I don't want to discount all the work we've done getting clean boots and washing our hands and putting a gate at the end of the road when, that guy has no idea how he got infected. It just happened, and then we deal with it then. So biosecurity is still important, but this may happen to you and we still don't have any idea why it happened to you.
Biosecurity is not a end all be all thing. Like, it's that insurance plan to help reduce your risk, but it doesn't eliminate your risk. And that is one of the key things when we talk about biosecurity is we're trying to reduce risk. We can't eliminate risk, because like HPAI and some of those others, they're moving with wildlife. They're moving with things that we have zero control on. There's things that can move in the wind. I think about invasive plants and noxious weeds and some of their seeds. Like, no matter what you do, it's still going to move because they move, regardless of humans. And so biosecurity is important to reduce our risk, but it never eliminates the risk.
I think that's something that USDA and folks have really pushed here with the New World Screwworm, shutting down our borders, making sure that they are analyzing the biosecurity plans of operations. We did open the doors back up for some time, and then they were closed again, right? So that to me indicates that communication is occurring. Folks are looking at these cattle and looking at these biosecurity practices. And I think it's really a crystal ball for us should any, and I tell my producers all the time, we talk about FMD or, foreign animal diseases and the big bad wolf, right? But there are other diseases that we face, even just daily diseases, that biosecurity can really help with, or diseases like HPAI that who would have thought would have been in dairy cattle, and we would have been having this conversation several years ago, right? So anything can really pop up and hinder us. So there's no wrong in being prepared for some of these things. And a lot of these basics that we go through, it's all very foundational, very simple. And then you can just build up those walls as you go, right? So Dr. Wolfgang, who helps us with our biosecurity workshops, he always tells everybody, we refer to it as a moat, building a moat around your operation. It's not entirely possible all the time, right? But if we think about it theoretically, you have a semi-good moat around your operation for daily biosecurity. It's pretty tight. And then in an event where we have a foreign animal disease or that big bad wolf knocking on our door, we can just move those walls back further. We can really analyze some of those larger or smaller risks and reevaluate how all of those come into play with that disease. But if we just have somewhere that we start with and we start making an improvement or two, I think back to, we used to, back in the day, watch Shrek all the time, right? And he would always say, ogres are like onions, we have layers. And I think that's sort of similar to biosecurity, right? Every small thing you do is another layer of protection. So I really think even if you can just get everybody to wear clean clothes on the farm and maybe clean out your trailer and isolate your cattle, you're going to be light years ahead of some of your other counterparts in all species. So I really think we've got to prepare for what's ahead. And sometimes we don't know what it is, right? So if we just have the basics down, then when that big bad wolf comes a knocking, we at least have some of that stuff. And we're not like, okay, guys, now we need to wear clean shoes and have visitor logs and do this and do that. And people don't even know what you're talking about. If it's a fluid conversation and you're implementing it now, it's, I think, going to be a lot easier, especially when we don't know what that's going to look like, right? We can all have a great plan and industry can talk about, and the state and Department of Ag, we can all sit down and have this plan, but when it hits, Lord only knows what's going to happen. It might be a crapshoot. So we can just prepare the best we can. And I just don't think there's any harm in being over prepared. And I'm a planner, so it's a little easier for me to say. Now, Grandpa, he's like, that'll never happen. It's fine. I'm like, okay, nope. Communication, education.
Absolutely. Sorry, Craig, do you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I was gonna say that's a great point, because we're still never sure what's that one thing we did that caused us the problem, and we can't be 100%. Like Jenny said, we can't be 100%, but at least if you're thinking about it, spending $20 extra for a second pair of boots, all of those things are good. They really are, and they'll help. And then, if the industry is going to help the producer that does get infected, there's a lot of help out there once that happens. But, we're just never sure. We don't want to downplay biosecurity, but we want to just make sure that, you're never sure where it's going to come from, which thing's going to happen. And we've all gone for years and years to the county fair, showed animals, brought them home, threw them right back into the freestyle barn. Nothing ever happened. That's not to say that this isn't going to be the year. But, if you're expanding your herd and you're going to buy animals in, boy, how do you manage that? Because now you brought 40 animals in. That's totally different than the fair. So there's just that heightened awareness, think about it and try to protect your herd as much as you can.
All right, so now we're kind of closing down. We're getting down to the point where maybe we need to wrap up, but I always like to do somewhat of a more fun question, still related to our topic. And I was just sitting here thinking, and I was thinking, you guys have spent a lot of time either teaching about biosecurity or talking to people. What are some of the worst misconceptions or things that you've seen in relation to biosecurity? Because a lot of people do learn by example. So what are some examples of things that you were like, okay, we probably shouldn't be doing that?
I just have a fun little story. So we were at a sale barn conducting a BQA training. And this was right when high path news kind of broke within the dairy sector. And so we were being extra cautious and requiring everyone. We always encourage folks to wear clean clothes and clean boots to the BQA sessions. But we wanted to really make sure we were leading by example. So we brought booties, and I handed a pair of booties to the gentleman, and he said, well, I don't need these booties to keep my boots clean. They're my crap kickers from the barn. I was like, oh, Lord, well.
You wore the wrong ones to start with.
Yeah, I'm like, well. I was like, while these are meant to keep your boots clean, it's clean from disease. And, so we had a quick little convo there, side note on what we were trying to prevent, and really encouraged folks, if they were ever going to a sale barn, even just to drop cattle off quick, that they definitely make sure they have a separate pair of shoes for the sale barn that are dedicated to the sale barn, because you don't know what is walking through those doors and what it has, right? So it was a great educational moment, but I just had to kind of crack up because he was like, oh, I don't need these booties to keep my boots clean. They're my crap kickers. I'm like, oh, Lordy. Okay. But, no shame on them, because oftentimes biosecurity is just not something that we always bring to the forefront of conversation and producer education. So, maybe it's a thing on our part where we just need to really weave biosecurity into a lot of these conversations with producers, because like I said, it's just something that maybe they're not necessarily familiar with, or maybe they are doing some things and they don't really know that that's biosecurity, right? So it's a fancy word for things they may or may not be doing, and risks that they may have. But yeah, I thought that was kind of a fun little little tale of biosecurity.
I have a little fun biosecurity story too. I teach conservation professionals and I preach to them not to touch the animals at the farm. So whether that's the farm cat, the dog, the livestock, whatever's there, like don't touch the animals, because you don't know if you're bringing something or if they have something and you don't want to take it back with you. So I talk about this all the time, but I grew up on a farm. I grew up around animals. I've worked on many farms. I love animals. Like it's just this thing. So I spent the day talking to like 50 conservation professionals, and then we went out to a farm, and the farm cat is walking through the crowd and sits down right in front of me and meows at me. And everybody around me is paying attention because they know that I told them they're not allowed to pet the cat, waiting for me to pet the cat and laughing because the cat definitely wanted my attention. And I refused to touch it, and it was really hard because I love animals, but when we have to practice what we preach. And so that's something that I really try to drive, with my other extension colleagues and everything, is we have to practice what we preach. So even though I really wanted to pet the cat, I didn't.
We hosted a animal meeting with a lot of vets and federal regulators, and we took them to a sale barn as part of the tour, specifically looking for that biosecurity experience. And it almost went overboard because everybody was looking at it. And luckily, we did have boots, or actually, what we did do is we didn't do boots there, but we did the foam mat to get back on the bus. And that may have just been total overload with that group, because you had Amish and truckers and people coming from 3 states away, and oh my gosh, it was a real experience. I don't know if that's the end all. We can't be down on sale barns because it could be as simple as anything else. But definitely, it's that commingling of everything that makes you really say, I need to have an extra pair of $20 boots just for this event.
Yep.
I'd like to know where Craig is getting $20 boots, to be completely honest, because I've not found a pair of rubber boots for $20 that are comfortable ever in my life.
Oh, goodness. I just like hearing everybody's stories and experiences. So I want to thank you guys for spending time with me today and answering all my questions and sharing your experiences. And I just wanted to let you guys have just a little bit of time. And if there's any last couple words or advice or anything that you would say that we haven't already touched on, so anything that's been rolling around that you want to say, speak now or forever hold your peace, I guess.
Clean on, clean off. So arrive clean and leave clean. Like that's as simple as it can be. As somebody that is visiting a farm, arrive clean and leave clean.
I would say get to know your resources, because if you think biosecurity, getting a written plan done is hard, or any of it is difficult or hard, or you have questions or you're not sure where your highest risks are or where to start, just know your resources, right? Extension, Beef Council, Center for Dairy Excellence, Center for Beef Excellence, the plethora of ag groups out there, the Department of Ag, Penn State University, Delaware Valley University, they all have experts in these fields. So just know who those folks are, or reach out to one of them. And if they don't know, or they're not the right fit for you, they'll definitely know who to turn you to help, because I think that's sometimes where a lot of good intentions go to die is I'm going to get started. And then they sit down and like, I don't even know where to start or what my biggest risk is. So we've got a lot of folks out there that are well educated and have a passion for it. So don't hesitate to reach out and know who those resources are.
I would say, think about it. You go to see your neighbor's farm, and you've got some heifers there, and a couple of them have a little ringworm. maybe we really don't need to see them today. So it could be, the simple diseases also. It's not always the world disease that's going to get us. But just think about it, and if you're going to somebody's farm or whatever, maybe you don't need to go in the freestall barn. You really don't need to. So, just having a conscious effort to think about biosecurity gets us a long way towards, having a good plan.
Absolutely. So thank you guys again for coming on and speaking. And I really enjoyed our time here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie.
I want to thank you guys all today for tuning in and listening to this episode of the Barnyard Broadcast. I hope you enjoyed our conversation and the topics of biosecurity as much as I did. As always, if you have any questions about biosecurity or any other livestock topic, please reach out to your local livestock educator or visit extension.psu.edu. There will also be other resources about biosecurity listed in the show notes that we may or may not have discussed within this episode. You can also view the show notes for the guest bios and information about our guests for today. That's all I have for you for this episode, but please keep an eye out for our next episode, which will air on July 2nd. Thank you guys, as always, for listening, and I will talk to you later.